Our first session is around the impact of COVID on consumer behavior. And obviously, there's a lot of work going on along this topic amongst our communities and in our companies. And I'm here to introduce to you our first moderator within this first session. Hi, Daniel. So good to see you. We have Daniel Rodriguez Sierra. He's the head of big data and advanced analytics from Vodafone in Italy. I believe you're reporting live from Italy today.
I'm looking at Lake Como as we speak.
Nice. Well, good. We're so glad to have you here. And so I'll turn it over to you to introduce our first set of speakers.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all for having me here and welcome to this afternoon session. We're going to be dealing with a really hot topic today because as we're in the middle of it right now, and in the companies that deal with large amounts of customers, this has been the questions that will arise during the session are of the highest importance, which is the impact of COVID on our consumer behaviors. In the next 40 minutes, we will hear some of the very revealing insights about not only how this terrible pandemic has changed our lives, but how it has even given us an opportunity to look at customer behaviors like never before. In a way, even if dramatic and terribly, the way that the customers' behaviors and the constraints have changed in such a systematic way allowed us to see large-scale behaviors like never before with controlled variables in a way. So it's important to realize that we are under conditions we have never seen before. It's the first time in all of humanity that people work for so long from home in such big amounts of people, or have to balance life and work in the same space during such a long time. So all of these are producing effects in all of us and in our consumers that bring about, of course, stress in our business, but also maybe new behaviors that we need to answer with new opportunities. In the telecommunications space, we see this obviously in a dramatic way. And then there are things that we can do for our community. So things like helping authorities trace the spread can be done with location analytics and stuff like that. So there is a whole amount of opportunities, if you see it on the bright side, that we will see and we will have the opportunity to analyze during these times. The questions like what has changed forever, what is only a transient change in behavior, all of these questions need to be answered and business need to adapt to these new changes. So to answer to some of these questions, we have a very notorious group of experts, of companies that deal with large scale business, right, with lots of people, and thus this is PepsiCo, MasterCard, and Spotify. I will, without further ado, introduce you first to the presentation from PepsiCo. This is Duncan McCall, CEO and co-founder of PlaceIQ in the US, and Abby Finns, the Senior Director for Portfolio Strategy and Analytics for PepsiCo US. Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, Duncan McCall here, co-founder and CEO, as you heard, PlaceIQ. So this is a first for me doing a icon presentation with a clear head, not having a late night in a Spanish city with tapas and cigars. So hopefully it will go well, but very pleased to be back here once again. So as you heard, so I'm going to talk around this concept of COVID, location data. How has it been relevant? Has it been relevant? And then I'm going to hand over to Abby, who's actually going to step you through how PepsiCo have been deploying this. And of course, the whole theme here is how can you use location data to understand this change in consumer behavior and make better business decisions? So if you think about this concept, PlaceIQ, we've been around for about 10 years, making sense of movement and behavior from location, opted in, privacy friendly, CCPA, NEI compliant. And you think back to sort of mid to late March, and I'm thinking to myself, wait, we're a company that understands consumer behavior based upon out of home movement. And I'm thinking, boy, in the biggest constraining of out of home movement we've ever seen, is location data still going to be relevant? And of course, it turns out that not only was it relevant, it became even more relevant than probably we anticipated. You've all probably seen some kind of graph like this, and we've been pushing lots of this information out. This, of course, is location data telling the story of what happened during COVID. And of course, what we've seen is we were able to see, segment by segment, how we were able to tell this story. And if you think of the segments that we saw in these behaviors, initially we saw this panic and prepare, everybody going to grocery stores. And what you're looking at here, these lines represent year-over-year change into certain business categories from location data from mobile devices. We saw the next phase, quarantine routine. Everybody now is getting into their routine of quarantine, right? Everything is depressed. And then, of course, the next phase is when we go into what we call this reemergence ramp. It's summer in the US. This green line here is everybody realizing, I'm going to be sitting in my garden for the next 2 months. I'm going to go to Home Depot and Lowe's and buy things. So certain sectors really high, certain sectors low. And then, of course, you see the next thing we saw was this kind of summer slump, right? The novelty is worn off and lots of things are depressed, but there's certain routines that are changing. Each one of these phases was different. And then, of course, sadly, the phase we're kind of in now, this fall flats, right? So this was a story of movement and through location data. We all kind of know now, but we could see this day by day, and then we could help businesses make better decisions during this time of unprecedented change. One simple example was this concept of what we think of as trade areas. So we were able to see clients who had locations in the top left that had a trade area that was heavily dependent on people who commuted to work. They were going to be really affected versus in the top right, here's a trade area that actually draws consumers from home, from the same brand of restaurant. So don't invest in the top left, invest in the top right, communicate to those people about pickup and delivery. Another change that we saw, one of my personal favorites, is this next slide shows a year-over-year change in quick service restaurants. And what you can see here is, McDonald's and Whataburger and Sonic, and they all go down during the panic and prepare. People aren't thinking about fast food. And then during quarantine routine, you suddenly see this red line spike up. And this is because in the US, Sonic is a chain that is almost all drive-in. This is a business that was built for COVID. Now we could see this day by day, and we could see this spike, and we could start to say, this particular category of business is doing really well. They should be doubling down. The other brands should be thinking differently. So an example of another change that we could see through location data. This is one we all experience, right? Visitation hours to grocery. People are going less, they're buying more, they're staying longer, they're driving less distance, but of course they're going at different times. Without a commute, you can now see post-COVID in the purple, everybody's shopping during the mornings and the evenings, not just outside of commute, but during the whole day. So if you think of this construct of how has location data from companies like PlaceIQ help clients make better business decisions, more effective deployment of marketing and media. Where should I double down? What categories should I not double down in? How do I think about it regionally during this changing time? In the middle, one of the problems was if you're a large company and you have many distribution outlets, what's happening with demand? Where are people actually going and what regions? How do I optimize my supply chain, my distribution? And then on the right-hand side, this overall data set of what is happening, we provided this for free to universities and nonprofits, et cetera, to make better decisions. So ultimately, this is a new way to understand consumer behavior in these unprecedented times and allow organizations to make better business decisions off the back of that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Abby, and I'm going to drive for her, and she's going to step through an example of how Pepsi has taken location data and used it internally.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. For perspective, my team sits at the heart of building a national US consumer narrative for the beverage business at PepsiCo, and also democratizing data solutions to customize the context of what's going on across all of our division teams. So as you can imagine, in March, when we found ourselves facing these three dynamics, right, all trend lines broke overnight. So our finance teams, all of our forecasting and approaches really came under question, which was a great call to action to, when all is lost, go human, and really to have some conviction around reemergence and recovery and understanding of our segments, needing to just tap into, as Duncan was talking about, human behavior. And that's what I like to call a premium on the primitive. So why ask and bother consumers in an environment like that if you can derive or observe information? And also we need to find a currency for many on my team. So we democratize our data solutions. So we need single data points with dimension. We were in the business of culling and curating for simplicity because we needed to be so timely in the insights we were bringing the organization. And why, you may ask? I think, we all felt this, but it's quite visible on the next slide where we pulled together, this is just an example of one of our retail channels and a pretty dramatic image. Again, I'm sure we all felt this, but how overnight foot traffic dropped off. This is a year-on-year index charted. So you not only see that steep decline, but you also start to see with the different colored lines that it wasn't happening equally across the board. And this is a retail channel. The same thing happened in gyms. The same thing happened in, outdoor leisure locations. So when we went to connect this very human and accurate, timely indicator with performance of our categories, and we saw humans not being mobile, essentially overnight, not going to gyms, not being physically active. And we also thought, well, we've seen other sources, they're seeking comfort. You put those two together and you very quickly could get out ahead of dynamics such as the COVID-19, right? So we were able to predict and very just primitively pull together a perspective that consumers were probably going to need to revert back to weight management as they realized where their physical activity had left them amidst COVID. So that's just one way we were able to connect, watching consumers not take on their traditional movements and understanding that they were also humanly seeking comfort, and what do those two combine to? On the next slide, we go deeper into this story that it really is impacting different pockets of the US in a very nuanced way. And this was something that became clear early on, but has become more pronounced as the virus has unfortunately made its way around the United States. So the green and blue lines at the bottom are looking at dining and retail traffic in New York. And the orange and yellow lines are just another city, Salt Lake. We were really closely watching a couple cities, both in this foot traffic data, but also other indicators like social and digital scraping. And what we saw going on in New York very much mirrored what we saw here. So at the time where consumers were put into quarantine, we saw interesting dynamics such as, not seeking energy drinks or caffeine as often, but really pursuing nutrition through beverages more. Those almost had a one-to-one trade-off overnight. So just an interesting way to connect what we're seeing go on with foot traffic and social indicators together into a category narrative. And this is a chart that looks at the impact of losing your daily commute. This is looking at one of our convenience and gas retailers' hourly traffic. I'll go quickly, but you see during quarantine, the gray bars, how much of a drop off it is, which really impacted things like a coffee business, which we've been able to help lean into and expedite recovery in. The next two slides we can just flip through briefly, really just showcase how we've democratized and ingested this powerful data across tools within the organization. And I wanted to close by saying that this context narrative of foot traffic speaking to reemergence and just tangible channel visitation has become part of consumer context and messaging up to executives around category outlook. So it's really proven to be a very real-time, agile, and human piece of data as we build a category outlook. So with that, I think we're out of time.
I was muted. So thank you very much. It's been interesting. We will have time for the next for some questions at the end. We will now move on to our next presentation. Okay, so now we'll like to introduce Carlos Fonseca. He is a Senior VP for Data and Services in Sales Strategy and Solutions, Financial Institutions and Insurance in MasterCard US. Carlos.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Okay, this is, as you said, a unique opportunity for us marketeers and people that like data to add value to our businesses. What is happening with COVID, it's requiring for all industries to start looking at rich data sets and understand something that is evolving very quickly, almost real time. And the ability to make decisions based on that consumer and commerce understanding is something where MasterCard can help. And in this presentation, I'm going to give you a glimpse of what we're doing. Each of these slides have a link where you can, after that, go and kind of like understand more in depth the topics that I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to try to give you an overview on the next 6 minutes and 30 seconds. So it's going to be challenging, but let's go. Next slide. So what I suggest for us to do is really have a view of what is kind of like the type of framework that we should use to understand how COVID evolves. And the idea here is really understand that framework in terms of phases. And all these industries go through phases. And kind of like as COVID evolves, we go into a containment phase. We have a kind of like a control phase, a normalization phase, and a growth phase afterwards. And what really happens is really we need to judge how these phases go in function of the momentum, positive or negative, in terms of concerns about the future. And this talks about understanding consumers in terms of, are they optimistic or pessimistic? What is the perception of risk? And in function of that, if they go out or not, if they respect social isolation measures or not. And ultimately, this is impacting how they spend, right?
Thank you very much. Again, Carlos, as you can see, now the whole scene that we were setting at the beginning is shaping more and more through these two fantastic presentations. Now let's close with what happens in the world of listening. So I want to introduce you to John Gibbs, who's Global Director of Advertising Research and Development for Spotify US. Go ahead, John.
Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, etc. My name is John Gibbs. I am the Global Director of Audience Research and Measurement here at Spotify. When we began to go into the period of COVID, when we started going into the period of folks staying at home, folks not commuting into their jobs, one of the things that we really wanted to understand was how these changes in behavior were going to change media consumption. We knew they were going to change commercial consumption, as the previous speakers have talked about, but for us, in terms of the nature of our business, understanding how media was incredibly important. So to be able to do this, one of the first things that we wanted to be able to do was to understand what were sort of some base behavioral trends that we were observing in the marketplace. And we really landed on sort of 5 key issues that we saw as being significant changes in the market. One, obviously, the reduced commute that folks have talked about. Children being at home was a significant change in media consumption. Increased usage of smart speakers. Smart speakers, while the total volume of smart speakers in the market have gone up somewhat over the past couple of years, the consumption levels have gone up quite significantly due to the time at home. An overall increase in consumption of podcasts. And then finally, screen fatigue. As we are all here at a live conference staring at screens, I'm sure we can all understand what screen fatigue actually means. So based on these trends, one of the things that we wanted to be able to do is figure out what are the specific ways that this impacts consumption on Spotify, really impacts the way that people listen to music and podcasts overall. So the first thing that we saw was that every day was Sunday. Typically, when you think about how people listen to Spotify, or frankly, most audio content, it kind of looks like a double-humped camel, right? That it's sort of in the morning commute and the afternoon commute, you tend to see much higher levels of consumption, with somewhat lower in the middle of the day and tapering off into the evening with a spike later in the evening for a younger audience. On a weekday. What we saw was a real confirmation of both the weekend and weekday consumption until they were almost exactly the same. The real differences that we honestly saw with weekday at this point was that it began to start a little bit earlier and kind of go a little bit later. And it looks like people had lunch later on the weekends. But other than that, really the way that people are consuming audio itself was pretty much the same. So this wasn't the only sort of key trend that we saw. One of the things that we wanted to understand is how, now that people were at home, how were they listening together? And so as part of qualitative research, we were asking our listeners How is confinement changed the way that you're listening? And so we have quotes like this. My wife and I typically listened a few times a week. However, now we listen almost 5 times a day as a result of the COVID-19 stay-at-home requirements. So how has this actually translated into actual consumption? Well, this brings us to our second trend, which is listening together. What we've seen overall is about 41% of listeners on Spotify say that they are listening in groups more often than they were previously, prior to the time of confinement during COVID. And what we're seeing is, on average, about 4 people listen together about 5 hours a day in those joint listening scenarios. So what we're beginning to see is consumption that looks a lot closer to either group viewership of video or kind of a harken back to the family sitting around the radio, rather than what you would necessarily think is sort of audio content being in your ears and sort of through earbuds, the way that we've thought about it really up to this point. The other area that we wanted to be able to get a sense of is, how has folks staying at home, how has COVID overall changed the way that people are consuming audio content overall? Are they listening on their phone still? Are they switching to smart speakers? Well, one of the things that we've seen is that devices like televisions that had traditionally been video content platforms have increasingly become audio content platforms, at least in the context of Spotify. What that means is, going back to this trend of screen fatigue, the TV is on either through a game console or through a smart TV. But what that TV is doing is playing the Spotify app rather than playing video content or playing gaming content in this case. And so the TV is on. The TV is still a media application or a media device, but that screen is really being used for audio content rather than visual content. In concert with this, when we were talking before about podcast consumption being up overall, and this is obviously an area that we care an awful lot about at Spotify. One of the things that we've really been trying to track against are, what are the types of podcast content that folks are listening to across multiple different demographics. And both due to COVID as well as the US elections, we saw really significant increases across the board in both news and government content consumption on Spotify. Really significant increases in terms of the volume of podcasts being listened to specifically in these areas. Where we saw some difference from a demographic standpoint or in a group by group standpoint is we tended to see older demographics being a little bit more skewed to society and culture. And what we saw in a lot of cases here is the society and culture content that was being consumed tended to be a little bit more sort of throwback content, if you will. So shows that were recapping old movies, shows that were talking about older albums. There was a lot of nostalgia in the society and culture content that folks were listening to, really kind of getting us not just being up to date, but sort of making us feel comfortable in the content that we listen to. And the sort of trend of nostalgia overall was not just pervasive in podcasts, which it was, but we also saw a significant increase in the rest of our more nostalgic content overall. The last sort of key trend that we saw is, one of the things we like to be able to do is to classify listening into multiple different types of attitudinal groups. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but one of the things that is not super surprising is that things like driving and commuting were way down. Things like kids and moody content were way up. But what was amazing to us when we looked at this is how clear it was across the world that it was all the same. It's very rare that you see any type of listening that doesn't differ all that much on a market by market basis. And this is one case where we saw it really significantly. So with that, thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. I don't know about you guys, but it amazes me to see how these common behaviors in across even different geographies and across millions of people become some homogeneous. I'd like to see if I can make a question each. Starting again with you, John, very briefly. The discovery analytics that brings about new behaviors, has that already prompted Spotify to create any new product or service?
Well, it's helped us shape up a bunch of different ways that we think about the market. We have definitely, I think, as everybody has probably seen who's keeping track, we've invested significantly in podcasts over the past couple months and past year. And one of the reasons why this was a focus, obviously, other than some of the other growth issues, was we did see behavioral shifts going this direction. We've also been looking much more deeply at the consumption specifically of smart speaker content and how we can enrich that type of experience more broadly with users rather than just necessarily a semi-screen experience.
Thank you. Now I'd like to address Duncan and Abby. You mentioned at some point that nothing is universal. So in that sense, if we now look at product categories, what would you say is the product category or the product categories where you found resilient behaviors, as opposed to other products that conversely had completely changed behaviors once you did reemerge?
Yeah, I mean, I can quickly give the PlaceIQ perspective, right? I mean, I think we saw early on all the things that everybody knows right now in terms of, you know, grocery and obviously home goods. But what we'd seen is I think the interesting stuff was we could see the stuff that was changing, but how was it changing back and how will it change back? And obviously we're still in this period of change, but what we'd seen obviously is people now starting to switch from local grocery trips to going to much more of a, you know, 1 or 2 trips every few weeks, larger store. And we've seen that, you know, not come all the way back now. So there's been a whole bunch of different categories where they've had this forced change in behavior, and we see it sticking. Now, ask us in a month or 2 months or 3 months how that changes. But I think the interesting stuff is to keep track of what has changed that didn't change for that last couple of years, and how is that changing back or not. So we're following many categories from that perspective.
Absolutely. Would you like to give an insight also, Abby? Or?
Sure. I mean, so I think a new space, perhaps I'll talk about coming out of COVID, that we saw very acutely come to life in quarantine was just more sophisticated needs across the energy spectrum. So if you think about consumers not having the typical physical transitions throughout the day to kind of refocus, reset, what we're seeing is consumers really need help unwinding. They need help focusing. They don't just need a quick boost. So we're really preparing a different set of solutions in the energy space. I think, you know, we saw a lot of, I alluded to comfort in my presentation. Our carbonated soft drink business continues to do quite well. And as occasions shift from out of home to in home, there's been a big sustained opportunity in that space. And certainly last but not least, in immunity, the growth there continues as consumers seek to, at varying degrees, you know, protect themselves with everything they're putting in their body more throughout the day. We do not anticipate that slowing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Carlos, lastly, I was about to ask about the stocking effect, but I think you mentioned that in your presentation, and it was also quite evident. But then the question is, if we're going towards more online shopping, what about the alternative payment methods that could be competing on a digital basis with yourselves? And then the other question is about the fact that many more outlets are now going to be doing online shopping. How does that affect your fraud space?
Yeah, I think that the pie is getting bigger on the digital side, and this is kind of like an opportunity for everybody. I think that the key there is really consumer education. So they actually interact with digital interfaces better, and they are aware about security, right? And at the same time, on the other side, the merchant education and resiliency. And we have created solutions that allow these merchants to be more secure. I believe that the pay is bigger for everybody. I believe also that there's very interesting social dynamics like intergenerational play that are educated consumer segments to be more digitally savvy, because the son and the father now happen to be around the table where they were not before. We need to understand this social interaction and also come up with these solutions to educate and make resiliency. Another solutions that are very interesting, which is parametric solutions, using all this information to actually trigger events and solutions in function of the data that we see.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we finally made the 3 questions. Thank you all. It's been a fantastic session, in my opinion. very rich in content. So hope we enjoy the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Daniel, thank you so much for moderating this session. COVID is obviously a very serious topic, but you and the speakers have helped us to find a bright side in all of this. So we'll continue on as data practitioners and marketeers and make the most of the data that we have. I really appreciate the overall mix of content. The relevancy of location data will continue. I love when all trend lines are lost, go human. I think that's a really great quotable quote. Of course, the rise of e-commerce, and it's great to hear a bit more detail about the changes in the ways that we're listening. So thanks again to Daniel and to all of you.